Welcome to the top 12 highlights of Chapter 12. I'm your host, Mr. Rodman, taking you through the executive branch and the presidency. All right, so let's take a closer look at the presidency and the executive branch by looking at the qualifications first. You've got to be 35 years old. You have to be a natural born citizen, although we don't exactly know what that means, and the Constitution didn't really clarify. And you need to be a resident of the United States for 14 years. So that also means that you need, in being a resident, you can be living on in an embassy or a consulate of the United States in a foreign country, and that would still qualify. The 12th Amendment finally corrected the problem that the Constitution had in terms of voting for a president and a vice president, rather than the first person with the most votes gets president and the second most votes gets vice president. Not a good strategy for two competing parties, and now it is essentially a ticket. The 12th Amendment corrected this because of what happened with the election of John Adams as president and Thomas Jefferson as vice president. So by 1800 that was corrected, and it did result in Jefferson winning the presidency over John Adams. The 22nd Amendment limits the president to the 22nd Amendment, think 2 terms. The president cannot serve more than 2 4-year terms, or up to 10 years in office. If they are taking over from another president who was assassinated or dies or is incapacitated, they can still serve 2 terms up to 10 years total, but no more than that. The 25th Amendment then created the line of succession. This was during the Cold War. The idea of presidential succession is that in the event of a nuclear bomb, what would happen if most, if not everyone, died? Who would be next in line to carry out the government and start over? And so they really created this long line of presidential succession. I always tell students to think of it like 25 deep in terms of the number of people that are listed, because it's the 25th Amendment. And the idea is that the president could be removed temporarily. This happened under George W. Bush's administration when he had surgery and he went under anesthesia. And Dick Cheney, the vice president at the time, served as president for a brief period of time until the president was able to was out of surgery and out of harm's way. And as a result, he assumed the presidency again under the 25th Amendment. So it was a successful transition of the 25th Amendment at that time. There is a way under Section 4 of Article 2 that the president can be removed from office. And this also applies to federal judges, those in the circuit courts or on the Supreme Court. And that's through impeachment. To impeach means to bring up on charges and send to a trial. The impeachment would happen in the House. The trial would happen in the Senate. In this case, the idea is that the House would impeach a president or bring them up on charges of impeachment, and there can be multiple articles of impeachment. There were multiple articles under William Jefferson Clinton, President Clinton, when he was impeached in the House. There were a number of them that did not pass, but only the ones that did pass impeached him, and then you move over to the Senate for the trial. Now, obviously, he was not removed from office, nor was Andrew Johnson, although it came within one vote of that happening. And Richard Nixon never made it to impeachment because he resigned before they were able to bring up those charges in the House and vote on articles of impeachment. So we've had only 2 presidents in which that has been the case. But a number of judges regarding bribery and racketeering, other types of corruption charges in which that was the case. Let's talk about the formal roles of the president. We have commander-in-chief, which we know about. We also have chief diplomat. These are the roles that are enumerated in the Constitution, that the president is commander-in-chief, chief diplomat, and chief executive. He's going to oversee what we know today as the bureaucracy, the millions of people that work within the bureaucracy, but also serving as chief diplomat, working with other leaders of foreign countries on trade agreements and other types of on behalf of the American citizens when they need visas or passports, or they've lost their passports, or they have a situation like the American that was in North Korea that was imprisoned, trying to get him out of there, and a number of other people we've tried to get out of there. And then Commander-in-Chief in terms of overseeing the armed forces and sending troops into harm's way in terms of in terms of a conflict or in terms of a humanitarian effort, such as the drought in Kenya, or the battle in Rwanda, or the Persian Gulf, a number of Afghanistan, Iraq. We could go on and on. But the idea is these are formal roles that the president has. And notice that the president also has informal roles in terms of economic planner, political party leader. Why is he the chief economic planner? Because of jobs, jobs, jobs. He is setting the agenda to create jobs, and if the president cannot create jobs, then he's probably going to take a hit on that in the next election. Either his party in Congress will take a hit on that in the midterm elections, or he's going to take a hit on it in the next presidential election. So the president's a chief economic planner. He's also a political party leader. He represents his party, being the person in the highest office in the land. He would be the political party leader in trying to get candidates to run for Congress and to run for governorships in the respective 50 states. So a significant role that he plays there in terms of getting people to sign up to run for office within his party. He is also the chief legislator, setting the agenda for what he wants Congress to take on, getting his executive liaisons to go to Congress and lobby members of Congress in the House and Senate on the issues that the president wants in order to sign a bill into law. And then chief diplomat, as we talked about in terms of the is more of a formal role. The head of state is more the informal one. We see them serving in capacities like going to funerals or weddings of other foreign dignitaries, other heads of state, more of a ceremonial role. And that one isn't a formal one, it's more informal. The chief diplomat, just to clarify, is the formal role. And the three that you see outlined here at the top are the formal roles. What we see as economic planner, political party leader, the chief legislator, and head of state would be informal roles, ones that aren't mentioned in the Constitution, but have kind of taken on a life of their own as implied powers that the president has. A signing statement, this is when the president either signs a bill into law or vetoes it and says why they're going to sign it or veto it, giving guidance as to why this is so important. Many times they'll just sign it in the office and we won't hear anything about it, but a lot of times they'll have people around them, as you see down here with President Reagan, signing a bill into law in order to send a message, in order to set a tone. President Bush signing a bill into law saying, well, I signed this because of this, this, and this, but there's other things in this bill I don't like, and here's why. That's a great idea for a signing statement, to really send a message to the American people as to more details as to why they're signing it, even though some parts of it may be controversial. So that's really where a signing statement can use that bully pulpit to really set the tone as to why this bill is being signed into law or why it's being vetoed. And while there's good stuff in here, I'm going to veto it because the majority of it is problematic because of this, this, and this. That really is sending a bigger message. Now, the War Powers Act of 1973 really was an attempt to limit the president in terms of what they could do in sending troops and being commander-in-chief of those troops. Congress basically created an act that the president could only send in troops in situations for a period of 60 days, then needed to inform Congress and could extend the time for another 60 days and so on for additional time beyond that. But they needed to inform, not necessarily get their approval, but to inform Congress that was happening. Now, if you look at Afghanistan, you can see that the president, George W. Bush, has sent in troops, and it's been longer than 60 days. I mean, it's our longest conflict, and it's now in its third president that's been dealing with it. So the War Powers Act, obviously, no one wants to take it before the Supreme Court anytime soon because they're afraid to know what the Supreme Court might actually think of it. No one wants to lose, so we haven't seen that taken up before the courts. But they kind of have a war of words over the War Powers Act in terms of the executive branch saying it's unconstitutional and the legislative branch basically saying that it is constitutional. And so that's kind of where we've left it for now. But to be continued, we'll see if someday that comes before the court. Executive agreements, these are like executive orders, but they're agreements made with other nations. They do have the full force of law. They don't need to be approved by the Senate, and they don't extend beyond the time that the president is in office. So once that president disappears and goes on to write a book and create a presidential library, the executive agreement also goes into the books of history because it no longer is valid either. And that's unlike a treaty that would stand the test of time or expire only when the expiration on the treaty that's ratified in the Senate would do so. We talked about the bully pulpit quite a bit, but the president has the power of the bully pulpit here to really set the agenda, because when the president speaks, people listen, and the media listen, Americans listen. The president uses the bully pulpit in a number of ways today. We don't just see this in press conferences and media briefings, but now we see this in terms of Twitter feeds. If you log on to the morning news shows and you see the president tweeting early in the morning, he is basically changing their agenda in terms of what they're talking about on the show. He can tweet at 6:30 in the morning, and the entire lineup on the show can be completely recast and reset in terms of the agenda they were planning to talk about just with a tweet. So the president has a significant power here to really send a message and set the agenda in terms of what the American people and what the media are talking about. And that is not to be taken lightly because obviously this is a power that can be used very effectively, and it's a power that can be used very ineffectively in terms of the type of message that's being sent out. Executive privilege is the idea here that the president wants to be able to talk candidly and openly with his advisors, especially the ones closest to him. How can he do that and do it effectively if they have to go and testify before Congress? That is an ongoing debate. The courts have ruled in some cases that the president has executive privilege, but in some cases not. During the U.S. v. Nixon trial before the Supreme Court, they basically said that the president didn't have the power of executive privilege here, that he had to turn over the tapes, and shortly thereafter Nixon would resign. But there have been claims of executive privilege in which members of the White House staff and the executive staff, depending on the individual, in which executive privilege rights have been honored, and that is, again, an ongoing debate between Congress and the president in terms of what is executive privilege. But the idea here is that it's dealt with on a case-by-case basis. But it does tend to blur the lines of separation of powers in terms of how should the president work with his advisors, how should Congress conduct hearings if they can't ask advisors questions about what's going on in the White House, and how high up does that essentially go. Impoundment of funds, this is the Budget Reform Act of 1974, which basically said, hey, Mr. President, you can't just use this money any way you want to if you don't want to spend it the way we wanted you to. So you've got to let Congress know within a significant period, and they have 45 days within that period to basically move the money somewhere else or take away the spending. Otherwise, the courts have upheld that the president can then use it in other places. But the Budget Reform Act, usually Congress is going to step in to make changes to it to keep the president from doing what the Congress has been constitutionally enumerated, given the power to do, which is the power of the purse. So while the president does have some fine teeth, some fine print to go through in order to get that money, chances are that the Congress and the courts have upheld it, said that really the power of funding has really been enumerated by Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. Now, who helps the president in terms of carrying out the agenda and setting the agenda and really getting laws passed so that the president can sign them, or vetoing ones they don't like? This is really the job of these four groups. We're going to talk much more about the independent agencies in the next chapter and looking at the bureaucracy. But the cabinet is the president's secretaries of the different departments. These are the people who work in the various departments and report up to the president. They meet in those cabinet meetings. And we'll take a closer look at those in a second, but the idea is that the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Education, those are all members of the cabinet. The White House staff are the people that are literally, physically closest to the president. These are advisors to the president, counselors, the vice president, the chief of staff, and senior advisors to the president that work in the West Wing, work in the White House to help the president in his agenda. The executive office staff are the ones that work in the old executive office building. These include the Council of Economic Advisors, the Office of Management and Budget, the National Security Council. Those work in the executive building next to the West Wing, next to the White House. But they, again, also work fairly close to the president, not as close as the White House staff, but they do work close to the president in terms of helping to set the agenda and carry out what the president wants them to. When you're looking at jobs as your role as chief economic planner, you're really relying on the Council of Economic Advisors here. When you're looking at the role of the bureaucracy as chief of the chief executive and chief of the executive branch, you're overseeing the Office of Personnel Management is going to be your guide. You're going to use the Office of Personnel Management in order to hire and make sure you're hiring the right people. They also determine when the government is open during bad weather, snow days and such. And then the trade representative working with the president on trade agreements and working with foreign leaders on those trade agreements. The White House staff, as I mentioned, are the ones that work in the West Wing. You can see it here in the picture. And they basically are working with the president on the idea of setting the agenda and getting that agenda out to the various cabinet members in the departments and the executive office staff in the different advisors and Council of Economic Advisors and such, and making sure that that's being adhered to, making sure that the president's agenda is being carried out. Now, many of the White House staff don't require confirmation, including the chief of staff, but the idea here is they have the president's ear, more so than many of them that are Senate confirmed. And so with that proximity, definitely comes power. The cabinet, as I mentioned, the idea here is that you've got 14 cabinet secretaries, an attorney general. They're overseeing a bureaucracy of 4 million people and a number of individuals here that are basically carrying out the president's agenda. They are the ones that are overseeing that civil service staff and telling them what is the priority in our department, in the Department of State. What is it that is our focus now that this new president is here? What is the focus in the Department of Education now that our new president is here? And this is really the role that the cabinet plays. Even when it's not a new president, they're setting the agenda in terms of, well, the president's given the State of the Union. What does the president want to focus on? This is really the cabinet's job. The secretaries of those various departments are carrying out that agenda. And you can pause it here and take a closer look in terms of what constitutionally is given to the president and the executive branch. But other than saying that the president would rely on people in various departments to help him in carrying out the enforcement of the laws, that's pretty much all the Constitution gives us guidance on in terms of the executive branch having a role. The big government, if you will, that's carried out that you see here is more a result of that enforcement of the laws and the granularity, the intricacies of carrying out the enforcement of those laws. Presidential appointments, we've talked about the idea of the cabinet departments, the secretaries. They are, all of these are serving at the pleasure of the president. The only ones that wouldn't be subject to the president firing is any type of judges that are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Those would only be removed by impeachment. They can retire or die on the bench, but those would be the only ways. The president could not remove a federal judge from a position that they've been appointed to and confirmed by the Senate. All of the others that you see here, and again, we'll go into more detail on the bureaucracy, looking at the cabinet, the independent agencies, regulatory agencies, and the executive agencies, as well as government corporations in the next chapter on the bureaucracy. But what you need to know here is that those agencies are headed by people who are appointed by the president. Some of them are confirmed by the Senate, some of them don't need to be, but the idea is that they can be removed at any time because they serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States. And this kind of breaks down how those are differentiated. Again, we'll go into this in more detail in the next chapter, but these are parts of the bureaucracy that represent 4 million people that are the civil service. Lastly, let's talk about acting appointments versus recess ones. The acting appointments, essentially, the president's short on time. Maybe there's less than a year left in the office. Someone has left to go write a book as a secretary of an agency, and the president is putting someone in a position that is an acting position. Many times, the role would end. At the end of a president's administration. The president doesn't want to seek Senate confirmation because there's not enough time and really not worth the effort to go through it all, only for the president to be leaving office. So an acting appointment is made. This was done with the education secretary in President Obama's last year of office. He appointed someone to the education secretary position because the person who was in that position went back to Chicago, the president's hometown, to take on a new role, and as a result, the president made an acting appointment. It doesn't need to have Senate confirmation. The president really didn't want to go through all that again. And when the president's term ends, so does all of the secretary positions within the departments. So why was it worth going through to do all of that over again? Recess appointments is a little different. This only happens during divided government. If you've got a controversial nominee that you want to name to a position and you don't want a Senate confirmation fight. So the president can bypass the Senate by appointing somebody while they're in recess, and instead the person is immediately takes office. This happens and obviously is controversial because the Senate doesn't like to be usurped in their authority to advise and consent the president on appointments. But it does happen when there's divided government. If you have a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, or a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, the recess appointments, and there's a lot of parliamentary procedures that they try and the Senate will try and do in order to keep the Senate open so that the president can't make that appointment. But there is a lot of back and forth on that. And obviously in a unified government like we have today with President Trump and a Republican Congress, there's less need for a recess appointment because for the most part you've got a Senate that is going to confirm their nominees, the Trump administration's nominees, because they're of the same party. So just one bonus to talk about presidential approval. Presidents say that they don't look at approval ratings, but they do. They say they don't like polls or they don't pay attention to polls, but they do all the time. One of the things that we see and one of the trends that you see most is people will rally around the flag when it comes to the American conflict or something that happens. After 9/11, after September 11th, 2001, we had a significant spike in approval for George W. Bush. Why? Because people were Americans before they were political parties. And so they saw that as, hey, the president is stepping up and being presidential in helping Americans and trying to resolve this and find out what happened and get the people that did this. He spoke on, at Ground Zero in order to really get people to rally around the flag, and it really showed. His approval rating went to 89%. Now, it's going to go down from there, obviously, as political parties start to fray the tensions once again. But we even saw this when George Herbert Walker Bush brought the troops home, sent the troops in after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait during the Persian Gulf War. We see a spike in the president's approval rating because they're rallying around the flag. Honeymoon period, the idea that the president has a particular very small window in which the press seem to love the president and really will write some really nice pieces about the president until basically the gloves come off and then it's put up your dukes and the press assumes their adversarial role. We see that President Trump if he had a honeymoon period, it was much shorter than other presidents past. And I think the honeymoon period is shrinking in terms of the leeway a president gets from being new in office, being the rookie in that role. But but the idea is that that it is a very short-lived time period. Now, what happens over time? We see that the presidents are thought of in a much greater light in terms of history than we see during their time. Harry S. Truman, for instance, after dropping the atomic bombs and winning the war over Japan, was a very controversial candidate in sending troops into Korea and the Korean conflict. Not very liked by the time he left office, and one of the reasons he didn't run for re-election was because of that. He was afraid he was going to lose, especially up against a popular general like Dwight Eisenhower. So he decided not to seek elective office and run for office, run for re-election. But as we see over time, give him 50 years, the history books tend to reward him, and we kind of see him in a much different light today. His popularity has actually improved greatly since that time period. And again, what's the final judge? History is, and it just depends on what your legacy is. What is your historical legacy in office? That's really what you want to focus on. What are you going to be remembered for? Because that's how people are going to remember you. That's going to impact your popularity over time. It's not going to be the knockdown, drag out fights over this particular bill or keeping the government open. What's the bigger picture? What's the bigger agenda that you're trying to set? Because that's what you're going to be remembered for, and that's going to be what's in the history books. I hope you've found this helpful in terms of the highlights of Chapter 12. Have a great day. Live the 5. Good luck on your quiz and upcoming test.